In late June of 1974, Davie Hay returned to Scotland from the World Cup in West Germany, having resolved to settle the differences with Celtic that had so marred the previous season and which had almost resulted in his sale to Tottenham Hotspur in the autumn of 1973. He was to find he had reached this decision too late. He relates in his biography, The Quiet Assassin, written with Alex Gordon. I was on top of the world when I returned from West Germany and had made up my mind that I would be staying with Celtic. I had discussed it fully with Catherine and I was going to accept what was on offer at Parkhead, buy a pub as a safety net and concentrate completely on getting on with business at the club that was always closest to my heart. There would be no more demands for a wage rise. There would be no more walkouts. I was, as always, prepared to do my utmost for Celtic and the supporters. Jock Stein had other ideas. I was summoned to Parkhead on a Sunday morning to see the boss. Jock was actually sitting in his Mercedes in the Parkhead car park when I arrived. I sat in beside him and he turned and in a very matter-of-fact way said, "I think it's better that you move on." This was probably the precise moment when Celtic failed in their quest for 10 in a row, and also the precise moment the Quality Street Gang project began to grind to a halt. The first member of the gang to establish himself as a first-team player, Davie Hay had become the beating heart of the Celtic team. Equally at home at fullback, central defence or anywhere across the midfield, Hay's drive, determination, ferocious tackling, powerful running and no little skill provided the platform for his more eye-catching teammates to flourish. He was the obvious candidate to succeed the now 34-year-old Billy McNeill as club captain, and probably more importantly, it was him on whom George Connelly depended most for emotional support. It's impossible to say if the George Connelly story would have turned out differently had Hay remained at Celtic that summer, but it is certain that without Hay, he was bereft of the friend he increasingly depended on. The loss of Davie Hay set in motion a chain of events from which Jock Stein's Celtic would never recover. The future had seemed so much rosier as Celtic embarked on their quest for 9 in a row in August 1973. But while they would succeed in that aim, and add the Scottish Cup with a 3-0 final win over Dundee United in May 1974, it had been a troubled season almost from the beginning. Remembered most of all for the disgraceful scenes in the European Cup semi-final first leg clash against the thugs from Atletico Madrid, which proved to be the last time Celtic reached that stage of the competition to date. Celtic's series of misfortunes during the 1970s began with Danny McGrain's fractured skull in March 1972, then Jock Stein's hospitalisation in late December 1972, and continued seemingly unabated from then. As the new season began in August 1973, the latest young star to emerge from the reserves, Brian McLaughlin, who had made his first-team debut 2 years before at the age of 16, suddenly burst onto the scene and was displaying the kind of skills that saw him tipped to reach the very top of the game. John Rafferty, previewing the Celtic v Hibernian Drybrough Cup final in the Scotsman of the 4th of August 1973, after describing the combination of Andy Lynch, Tom Callaghan and Davie Hay on Celtic's left-hand side, went on to discuss the opposite side of the field. "And as Stein has these three playing wide on the left, he has another, but more subtle triangle on the right, using the extraordinary skills of the 18-year-old Brian McLaughlin. He is a beautiful player and as effective as he is graceful. Steve Murray links well with him and Danny McGrain comes through in support." As if to illustrate the mood of optimism surrounding Celtic, as inspired by McLaughlin they started the new season on fire, Rafferty concluded, "Hibs I can visualise playing as well as they did in the final last season, but I think that Celtic are a much better team than they were then. Indeed, some have been talking about this reorganised lot in the same breath as the 1967 team." McLaughlin, already tipped to be Jimmy Johnston's long-term successor, was the undoubted star of the early part of the season, including an impressive performance in a League Cup win over Rangers at Ibrox on the 18th of August 1973, and had already scored 3 goals of the highest quality before the second league match of the season at home to Clyde on the 8th of September 1973, when all 11 players wore number 8 on their shorts to mark the unfurling of the league flag for the 8th year in a row. Late in the first half, the young McLaughlin sustained a serious knee injury in a challenge with Clyde centre-half Willie McVie. It was a challenge which is remembered with a great deal of bitterness by many of the players and most of the fans who witnessed it, and McLaughlin, before his tragic early death in 2009, refused to ever utter McVie's name. None of the newspaper reports of that weekend, though, make much mention of the challenge. Jim Blair reported in that day's Evening Times, "In 34 minutes, Celtic made a substitution when McLaughlin was injured in a clash with McVie. Jimmy Johnston came on to a tremendous cheer from the crowd." William Hunter, in the Glasgow Herald of the 10th of September 1973, makes it sound as if no one else was involved. "There was yet another deeply emotional moment in the first half. When Brian McLaughlin fell hurt, Jimmy Johnston came on. Once again, the stand rose to its feet." Alan Heron, in the Sunday Mail of the 9th of September 1973, came closest to any hint of criticism of McVie. "In 32 minutes, young Brian McLaughlin collapsed under a power tackle from McVie and was carried off holding his right knee." David Potter and Tom Campbell write in Jock Stein, The Celtic Years, "Jock Stein was introducing youngsters into the side in less important fixtures, and Brian McLaughlin, a promising midfielder said to be better than Dalglish at a corresponding age, was fielded. The promise certainly was there in his ball control and passing, and the indefinable air of maturity was present, even at the tender age of 18. But in an accidental clash, his knee was damaged, and Jock Stein, who once described himself surprisingly as a big soft-hearted old miner, cried tears of pity when he learned the extent of the boy's injury." The injury was severe, torn knee ligaments requiring an operation and a lengthy hospital stay. Knee surgery in 1973 was a far more rudimentary procedure than it is now, and McLaughlin was fortunate that the injury did not end his career. He returned to the first team in April 1974, scoring a brilliant solo effort in a league match against Morton, but he never again hit the heights of August to September 1973 after that injury, and almost drifted away from the game altogether before joining Ayr United in October 1977. He was the First Division Player of the Year in 1978-79 and won a £100,000 move to Motherwell, where he became the inspiration of Davie Hay's promotion-winning side of 1981-82. After moves to Hamilton, Falkirk and a spell in Australian football, he returned for a final season at Ayr United in 1986-87. In an obituary published in the Glasgow Herald on the 18th of August 2009, Matt Valance wrote, "He returned to find MacLeod back at Ayr and eager to sign him. No longer the thrilling raider of his earlier days, McLaughlin settled in to be United's playmaker in midfield, although the odd spectacular goal was still scored. To go to Ayr during his second spell was to witness a great footballer in action. Some of his passes were beyond the imagination of lesser players. But his knee was increasingly bothering him. MacLeod gave him his coaching baptism. He bowed to the inevitable and hung up his boots to end a good playing career, but one which was not what might have been." Former teammate Andy Lynch is quoted on the Celtic Wiki website. "He did lose pace because of the injury, but also he lost a large percentage of mobility in the leg. Brian achieved what he did at Ayr and Motherwell with limited movement. How he ever passed a medical for a £100,000 move, I will never know." Celtic were robbed of an enormous talent when Brian McLaughlin was injured in September 1973, but more importantly, the player himself was robbed of the brilliant career that seemed his for the taking. The quality of the Celtic side would decline sharply over the second half of the decade, and the Brian McLaughlin of August 1973 should have been by then only approaching the peak of his career. There was nothing Jock Stein could have done to keep Lou Macari at the club, or prevent that awful injury to Brian McLaughlin, but it was very much his decision a week later to allow the departure of Bobby Murdoch to Middlesbrough, and with the benefit of hindsight, that was a huge mistake. It seems almost incomprehensible that Bobby Murdoch, regarded by virtually all of his teammates as the best footballer at the club, was not just allowed to leave Celtic at the age of 28, but was actually given little choice in the matter by the manager. Stein's major concern over Murdoch was the issue of his fitness, and Murdoch's problems in this area went all the way back to an injury to his right ankle in a match against Hearts as an 18-year-old in March 1963. An accidental clash with Hearts goalkeeper Gordon Marshall Sr., who would later have a brief spell with Celtic, damaged his ankle, although the seriousness was not immediately recognised. In his biography of Murdoch, Bobby Murdoch, Different Class, David Potter writes, "Funnily enough, there were no apparent immediate effects, for Bobby was able to train the next day and indeed to play on the following Saturday in a league game against St Mirren, scoring Celtic's only goal. In fact, he missed very few games between the injury and the end of the season. This may have been unwise. Perhaps a few games off at this stage might have prevented a great deal of trouble in the future. But at the age of 18, after an enforced layoff because of bad weather, who would want to drop out of the team and risk losing his place permanently?" For the rest of his career, Murdoch was plagued with ankle problems and was very rarely fully fit, making his outstanding contribution to Celtic's sustained success in this period all the more remarkable. Even in the European Cup final in Lisbon in 1967, he played with his ankle heavily strapped after aggravating the injury in training. Potter writes, "Before every game, he had to bathe it in warm water and then wrap bandages around it. The result was that he would often take the field looking as if his right ankle was twice the size of his left. And indeed, he would frequently ask people to look at footage of the European Cup final in 1967, slow down the action and look at the comparative size of his feet. He would also aver that he kicked the ball with his right foot no oftener than about half a dozen times that night. Such was the pain involved." A knock-on effect of Murdoch's ankle problem was periodically being unable to train, with resultant weight problems. Pre-season training for the Lisbon Lions was surprisingly sophisticated for the era, with the squad split into two different groups, their training tailored according to their body types. Murdoch was part of the heavy mob, alongside players like Tommy Gemmell, Billy McNeil and John Hughes. A natural tendency to carry weight was exacerbated by the ankle problem, which in turn was worsened by having to bear extra weight. A vicious circle which was increasingly having a detrimental effect on his performances by 1969. David Potter writes, "Bobby was 25 in August 1969. He was now quite clearly filled out and he was a big lad, now commonly referred to by the Celtic punters as Big Murdoch, Big Murdy, Big Bobby, or even just, in the true Glasgow way, as Big Man." Having missed a series of games in the opening period of season 1969-70, Jock Stein took the drastic decision to send him to a health farm, Leaf's Nature Cure Centre in Tring, Hertfordshire, where he was put on a crash course diet and given intensive physiotherapy on his right ankle. A smiling Murdoch was photographed on the back page of the Daily Record on the 6th of October 1969, extolling the benefits of his stay. I weigh 12 stone 2 pounds now, which is £2 less than I weighed when we won the European Cup in Lisbon. It was pretty bad to start with in England, but I got used to it, and the stone I lost mostly went in the first week. After that, it was just a matter of getting my strength back. I don't have a diet sheet now, it's merely a matter of eating sensibly. Judging by Bobby's Slimmer's lunch yesterday, it looks as if his weight worries are over." Murdoch returned to the side rejuvenated and was immense in the run to the 1970 European Cup final, winning the admiration of Fiorentina manager Bruno Pezzaola, who told reporters after Celtic's quarter-final win over the Italian champions, "Murdoch is the papa of the team, the rest are the sons around him." Masterful performances against Leeds United at both Elland Road and Hampden powered Celtic into the final, but he was unable to replicate this in Milan, as a lacklustre, ill-prepared and complacent Celtic were outnumbered and outworked in midfield. That final wasn't the beginning of the end for Stein's Celtic, but it was the end of the beginning, and by the summer of 1971, after a long hangover from Milan, there were serious question marks over Bobby Murdoch's future as the break-up of the Lisbon Lions began in earnest, with the departures of Bertie Auld, John Clark and Steve Chalmers. Murdoch had a long spell on the sidelines through injury in the second half of the season, and after the Lions' final appearance on the 1st of May 1971, was not selected for the Scottish Cup final a week later. A return visit to the health farm in Tring followed, and by the beginning of season 1971-72, he was again back to his best. After Celtic's 2-0 League Cup win over Rangers at Ibrox on the 14th of August 1971, Jim Parkinson wrote in the Glasgow Herald, "On this performance, Murdoch disproved the old axiom that they never come back. He has had his full share of injury, and more seriously, weight trouble, but he is in the team again, fitter than ever, and without having lost his immaculate passing skills. When he is directing the flow accurately, Celtic are at their peak, and this was how they secured the initiative in their League Cup section." In the early part of the season, Murdoch was inspirational. But as late summer gave way to autumn, he picked up another injury in a match against Morton on the 18th of September, and on his return almost a month later was to endure a bumpy period, including the embarrassing 4-1 defeat to Partick Thistle in the League Cup final on the 23rd of October 1971, in which he captained the side in the enforced absence of Billy McNeill through injury. David Potter writes in Bobby Murdoch, Different Class, "Murdoch had one of those days in which nothing would go right, and by the end of the game seemed to be limping again." Potter suggests Murdoch was now not only struggling with physical problems, but going through a crisis of confidence, especially in the wake of Willie Wallace and John Hughes being offloaded to Crystal Palace in the days before the League Cup final. He writes, "Murdoch was now in a lot of trouble. In addition to his physical problem, there was now the psychological one of having been seen to fail when the added responsibility of the captaincy had been thrust upon him. His dream of accepting a trophy as captain of Celtic had come to naught, and there could be little doubt that a great deal of the all-important appetite for the game had disappeared with it." Yet Bobby Murdoch recovered from this mid-season low point and was back in the midfield to guide a young side past Uspestosa in the quarter-finals of the European Cup in March 1972, and gave dominant performances in both legs of the semi-final as Celtic came within a penalty kick of a third European Cup final. John Rafferty wrote of the second leg at Celtic Park in The Scotsman of the 20th of April 1972, "Murdoch was a magnificent player, a master in midfield, authoritative, inventive, inspiring." He carried this level of performance into the Scottish Cup final 6-1 destruction of Hibernian a few weeks later. Rafferty continued on his theme in The Scotsman of the 8th of May 1972. "The simple explanation of Hibs' defeat is that Bobby Murdoch established himself as boss of the midfield. He ruled that area with the haughty majesty of a ringmaster, bringing order to it and sending out his acts to delight the audience." Hugh Taylor, meanwhile, wrote in the Daily Record that day, "Celtic had the players. Johnston, Deans I've mentioned, but the greatest was Bobby Murdoch. In this form, the finest middleman in Europe." Celtic were undoubtedly at their best when Bobby Murdoch was at his best. But by the end of season 1972-73, and still only 28 years old, those weight and injury problems seemed to have put his best days behind him, and the signing of Steve Murray from Aberdeen on the 1st of May 1973 signalled the end of his Celtic career. Murray could not compare as a player to Bobby Murdoch at his peak, but despite their being the same age, by 1973 the impressive Murray was significantly faster and more mobile. Murray made his debut in midfield alongside Bobby Murdoch in Jack Charlton's testimonial match as Celtic played Leeds United on the 7th of May 1973. But following this, Murdoch made only one more competitive appearance against Arbroath at Gayfield in a League Cup sectional match on the 29th of August, and he was released to join Middlesbrough on the 17th of September 1973. Bobby Murdoch was a huge loss to Celtic, but at the time his departure was seen as inevitable, time having taken its toll on his body and curtailed his effectiveness and ability to dominate and dictate matches as he had once done so imperiously. David Potter writes significantly of Stein's decision to give him a free transfer. "There is also the undeniable fact that if Middlesbrough had had to pay a large fee, they would naturally have insisted on a medical, and Bobby's ankle would never have passed such a test. It's hard to be too critical of Stein's decision to release Murdoch, but as he had done twice before, the player would bounce back from the depths to inspire his new club to promotion in 1973-74, taking them back to the First Division after 20 years out of the top flight, runaway champions with a record 65 points total. He then played 2 seasons for Borough in the First Division, taking them to 7th place in 1974-75. In all, he made 95 league appearances for Middlesbrough in 3 seasons, scoring 6 goals. Middlesbrough fans who remember the era still regard Bobby Murdoch as one of the greatest players their club ever had. It's easy to say now, but who knows what might have happened if the Bobby Murdoch who was inspiring Borough to promotion to the First Division in April 1974 had instead been at Celtic Park to bring some composure to the Celtic team that hammered away fruitlessly at an eventually 8-man Atletico Madrid in the semi-final of the European Cup. The early part of season 1973-74 gave no hint of how troubled it would turn out to be, with some high-scoring performances in the Dryborough Cup before the usual defeat in the final, again to Hibernian on the 4th of August. The run included an emphatic win over South American champions Penarol and 2 victories at Ibrox, one in the League Cup, the other in the league. But by the time the league season began, with a 3-2 win over Dunfermline at East End Park on the 1st of September 1973, Davie Hay was on the transfer list. The situation with Hay arose just 8 months after the departure of Lou Macari, but while it had its parallels with that case, there was a key difference. Davie Hay didn't actually want to leave Celtic. Hay's demands centred on not so much the total wages he could earn at Celtic, but on the basic wage Celtic were willing to pay. Lou Macari writes in his autobiography, Football My Life, that most Celtic first-team players in 1972 were paid around £50 a week, while the top earners, Billy McNeil and Jimmy Johnston, were earning £90 a week. Davie Hay's recollection in The Quiet Assassin was that he was paid a basic £65 a week. This basic wage was topped up by a £5 appearance payment and a win bonus of anywhere between £50 and £100, depending, in Macari's words, on how Jock saw the game. So if Celtic won 2 matches on a Saturday and in midweek, the players involved could be paid potentially up to £260 for the week, at a time when the average working man was earning around £32 a week. The problem was that players who were not picked, whether through injury or loss of form or a tactical decision by the manager, would be paid just that basic £65. Davie Hay injured his knee in a Scottish Cup tie at Tynecastle on the 27th of March 1972 and did not return to the first team until the 11th of October. Over that period, he would have missed out on a substantial amount in appearances and win bonuses. What Davie Hay wanted was a much higher basic wage. He writes in The Quiet Assassin, "My head wasn't turned by what I heard Scottish players in England were earning. Good luck to them was my response. Leaving the club I genuinely loved wasn't a priority. I wanted to stay and get the rate of pay I thought I deserved. I told the club I thought I was worth £100 per week. As you might expect, they disagreed. I had missed some of the previous season through injury, and suddenly I realised it was difficult to make ends meet on a basic £65 when you stripped your normal wage of bonuses and first-team appearance money. I felt the pinch, and so too did my family. I had to take action." One similarity with the Macari saga from earlier in the year was the interest of Manchester United in the player, while Jock Stein was determined he would go elsewhere once Hay's transfer demand had been accepted. The Daily Record reported on the 3rd of September 1973, "Manchester United manager Tommy Docherty has started negotiations with Celtic boss Jock Stein for unsettled international star Davy Hay. And the bait the Doc is using to tempt Celtic is former Partick Thistle fullback Alex Forsyth, currently out of the Old Trafford first team. I understand that United are ready to bid around £100,000 in straight cash plus Forsyth who cost the same figure just 6 months ago when he moved south. Yesterday though, Celtic were saying little beyond the statement made by manager Jock Stein after the game at Dunfermline on Saturday, when he said, "Davie Hay has refused re-signing terms, although we offered him an increase on the terms he had. We have tried to satisfy his demands, but we cannot. It has never been our policy to hold dissatisfied players, and that still holds good. But we won't be letting Hay go until there is the prospect of an incoming player." 8 months before, Stein had sent Lou Macari neatly gift-wrapped and tied with a bow to his close friend Bill Shankly, only to see Liverpool blunder by sitting Manchester United assistant manager Pat Crerand right next to him in the stand at the Liverpool-Burnley FA Cup replay on the 16th of January 1973, before they had gotten around to ensuring Macari had signed on the dotted line. Macari spent the following day being wooed by Shankly before saying he needed to think things over. He returned home and promptly signed for United, having arranged to meet Docherty and Crerand at Glasgow Airport the night before. Now, while United made strenuous efforts to sign Hay, Stein was determined that there was no way Tommy Docherty would take another player from him. Lou Macari was on his way barely 2 weeks after Celtic agreed to his transfer request at the beginning of January, but there would be no quick move for Davie Hay, and the saga rumbled on for months, Celtic refusing to agree to United's valuation of Forsyth, and immediately after a 1-0 win over Ayr United at Somerset Park on the 10th of November 1973, Hay travelled to London for talks with Spurs. There were conflicting reports in the press on Hay's return from London. Ken Gallagher wrote in the Daily Record of the 12th of November 1973, "I flew back from London with Hay yesterday. He had just left Nicholson and the Spurs chairman after a 2-hour talk at a luxury hotel. He told me, 'I was very impressed with Mr. Nicholson. He was very honest with me, very straight, and the terms are excellent. I haven't made any secret of it. The reason I want to move is to better myself financially, and Spurs did talk very good terms. The one problem that really worried me was the cost of housing in and around London, but even there, Spurs have said they are prepared to help me. In fact, that obstacle has more or less been removed in our talks. Now though, I have to discuss everything with my wife. It's a big move and it's a long way from home for her. I'm glad the whole business is coming to an end. It has dragged on for a long time now. I'll be in to see Mr. Stein at Celtic Park first thing in the morning to tell him of my talks." The prospect of a move to Spurs didn't seem so close in that morning's Glasgow Herald though, with Ian Archer reporting, "Hay, who left for England immediately after Celtic's match against Ayr United, said on his return, 'I haven't come to any agreement with Spurs. I'll be waiting to see if anything else turns up.'" What turned up was another attempt by Tommy Docherty to take Hay to Manchester, but he would find it much more difficult than Spurs did to reach agreement with Celtic. By the following day, United announced they had dropped their interest in the player, and Tommy Docherty spoke bitterly to the press about Celtic's apparent refusal to conclude a deal. He told the Glasgow Herald of the 13th of November 1973, "It seems to me that there is one price for our club and another for Tottenham Hotspur. Celtic approached us 2 months ago to ask if we were interested in Hay, and we immediately offered to pay £200,000 for him. Celtic later put forward an idea for a player exchange deal involving Alex Forsyth, but they backed down on that deal after I had spoken to our player, something which had an unsettling effect on him. 10 days ago, Celtic came back to us and said that the price was now £225,000, but it also appears that they afterwards agreed a figure of £200,000 with Spurs. It should be the same price for everyone. Celtic are trying to hold us to ransom, and that is quite wrong. When Manchester United sell players, they always quote the same price to everyone. We are too big a club to go in for this kind of thing." Hay remembers in The Quiet Assassin, "I have to say, I could see me fitting in at United." Big Jock had other ideas though. He told me he would not sell me to Manchester United. I don't know if he was still upset by Lou's move to join Tommy Docherty's clan the previous year, but he would not budge on his stance. "You'll go where we tell you to go," I was informed. Jock wanted me to move to Spurs and accept the £10,000 payoff from the club. There would be no lump sum if I persevered in trying to get to Old Trafford. United, I was reliably informed, were willing to match any transfer fee that Spurs put in. Still, Jock was having none of it, and, naturally enough, that angered me. It was at this point that Hay decided on the drastic measure of going on strike. The situation must have had an unsettling effect on the dressing room, and now as it came to a head, it prompted a walkout by George Connelly. Connelly was a fabulously talented footballer and the current Scottish Football Writers' Player of the Year. He should have had the world at his feet, but he was already showing signs of the emotional frailty that would eventually lead to him turning his back on professional football altogether at the age of only 26. The first public sign of any problem came in June 1973, when he was selected for the Scotland squad to play Switzerland in Bern. The party flew from Glasgow Airport to Heathrow for a connecting flight to Switzerland, but only after arriving in London did the management realise Connelly was not with them. He had called a taxi at Glasgow Airport 10 minutes before boarding and gone home. Reactions to Connelly's walkout were mixed. He was called before the SFA 2 months later, and Sandy Beveridge reported in the Daily Record of the 17th of August 1973. Scotland's soccer bosses yesterday quietly sidestepped out of the case of the runaway footballer. Celtic's George Connelly, the man who walked out on Scotland just 10 minutes before they left for the match against Switzerland in June, left the SFA headquarters in Glasgow yesterday with a smile on his face. He wasn't suspended. He wasn't fined. The International and Selection Committee didn't even tell him he had been a naughty boy and not to do it again. They merely said, with all the understanding of a doting parent, that they realised the player was under considerable pressure because of his wife's condition, so they felt that no action should be taken because of a single act they regarded as being out of character. Connelly's wife Christine is expecting their second child at the weekend. But with this action, the SFA lost a glorious chance to prove to the public that discipline still matters. It was a time when we could have taken a lead from the English FA. Last season, they banned Derby's Colin Todd and Chelsea's Alan Hudson for 2 years. Their crime was not going on an under-23 tour. They didn't wait until the last moment, and they didn't pull out of a full party. In the Glasgow Herald that day though, Ian Archer was far more understanding. He wrote, "It needs to be said that the Celtic player is not cast in the usual footballing mould. He is shy, quiet and intensely a private person. If you had to describe him in a word, then it must be sensitive." The SFA decided, quite rightly, that this was not a routine disciplinary matter. Connelly had not broken curfew or roistered it up in some foreign hotel. There was no question of any serious misbehaviour on his part. In that respect, their judgment seems eminently fair and laudable. On the pitch, Connelly picked up where he had left off the previous season and finally gained his first full cap for Scotland, alongside Quality Street gang mates Danny McGrain, Davie Hay and Kenny Dalglish, as well as Celtic goalkeeper Ali Hunter, on the night they qualified for the 1974 World Cup finals in West Germany, beating Czechoslovakia 2-1 at Hampden on the 26th of September 1973. Connelly played again for Scotland in a match arranged to mark the centenary of the SFA against West Germany on the 14th of November 1973, when Scotland were unlucky not to record a famous win, Billy Bremner missing a penalty with Scotland 1-0 ahead and scorning numerous chances before the Germans grabbed a late draw. At this point, it looked as if Connelly was a certainty to play in the World Cup finals, but he would not start another football match until the 10th of February 1974. With Hay on strike, Connelly didn't turn up for Celtic's match against Partick Thistle on the 17th of November 1973, although it was kept quiet on the day. The absence of Hay and Connelly didn't stop Celtic turning in one of their most impressive displays of the season, or stop Dixie Deans from recording a piece of history. The match kicked off at 2:15 p.m. because the government had that week banned the use of floodlights during the energy crisis caused by a combination of rocketing oil prices as a result of the oil embargo imposed by Arab countries following the Arab-Israeli war the previous month, and strikes by the miners and rail workers. It seemed entirely in keeping with the times that Hay and Connelly had gone on strike. It seems almost churlish to say that Dixie Deans missed several chances that day, but he still set a new post-war scoring record for Celtic with 6 of the goals in their 7-0 win. One miss came early in the match, while many fans were still coming into the ground after dragging themselves reluctantly out of the pubs, which until the 1980s closed between 2:30 and 5 p.m. Jim Blair reported in the Evening Times that night, "The first whistle sounded before last orders were called in the local Parkhead pubs. The ground was still filling up when Thistle kicked off. Early play was cautious, and it wasn't until the 7th minute that the crowd got something to shout about. A bad clearance by Thistle captain Ronnie Glavin put Hood in possession, and his through ball gave Deans a chance. But the Celtic striker shot wide." The Hood to Deans combination became the motif of the match, and Bill McLaughlin in the Sunday Post of the 18th of November 1973 was at pains to point out Harry Hood's contribution, while Deans understandably was the centre of attention. He reported with a touch of poetry, "Naturally, it's very difficult talking about anybody else when a bloke scores a spectacular double hat-trick, and in a Glasgow derby at that. So this is as good a time as any for Harry Hood to take his bow. If Dixie grabbed all the headlines, it was Harry who was the story behind the glory." After scoring his first 2 with headers, Deans completed his hat-trick in just 25 minutes, taking a Hood through ball and rounding Alan Rough before slamming it past a Thistle defender on the goal line. All this, Jim Blair reported, and with spectators still streaming into Parkhead. 2 more Celtic shots, one from Deans, the other from Tom Callaghan, were cleared off the line, but no more goals were added before the interval when Kenny Dalglish was replaced by Paul Wilson. 11 minutes into the second half, Deans flicked another Harry Hood cross into the net, and on 64 minutes, Bobby Lennox put Celtic 5 ahead. Deans' 5th goal in 74 minutes equalled Celtic's post-war record, held jointly by John Hughes, Steve Chalmers, Bertie Auld, and, watching from the dugout, Neil Mochan. That left him plenty of time to not only break the post-war record, but also the all-time record, held by another man watching the action from the director's box, Jimmy McGrory. McGrory scored 8 goals in a 9-0 win over Dunfermline in January 1928, which is still the British record for a top-flight match. Deans missed 2 glorious chances in the closing stages before netting his 6th 30 seconds from time. Again, Hood was involved, but this time he could have scored himself, choosing instead to lay it on a plate for his record-chasing colleague. Ian Archer captured this moment in time most eloquently in the Glasgow Herald of the 19th of November 1973. Parkhead went slightly delirious in the gathering gloom as this huge compilation was built up, the applause growing to a raucous crescendo as the last was scored with the final kick of the ball. This was all the stuff of tales to be told to disbelieving grandchildren. The press box went slightly demented along with the rest of the ground, and we whipped it up with the fans clapping him from the field. A rare, almost unique compliment. For Dixie, the goal scorer, is Dixie that most companionable of all footballers. If he were not so well liked, he would have scored 4. But his friends, Harry Hood in particular, helped him towards 6 by sacrificing their own chances to make way for more goals from the most likeable character in the Parkhead dressing room. Hood, I suspect, will be remembered as long as Dixie, for his was true sportsmanship in the later stages, turning 2 balls back for the centre-forward and thus making his own contribution to a perfect day. A very parfait night, as Chaucer might have said. The first person to congratulate Deans as he left the pitch was the great McGrory, who had left his seat in the director's box to greet him in the tunnel. Dixie remembered in his autobiography, There's Only One Dixie Deans, written with Ken McNabb, I only found out how close I'd come to Jimmy's record when the first person I bumped into was none other than the man himself. I knew Jimmy because he was still a regular face at Parkhead, having been the Celtic manager immediately before Jock. A lovely man, Jimmy's face was a giant grin, and he shook my hand warmly as he said, "I've waited a long time to see someone do that, and I really thought you were going to break my record today. And you should have." Deans was presented with the match ball, autographed by both sets of players, with an unnamed Partick Thistle player quoted in the Daily Record of the 19th of November 1973. There are more marks by Dixie's head and feet on the ball than there are autographs. The Dixie demolition of Partick Thistle saw Celtic 3 points ahead of joint second-placed Hearts and Aberdeen at the top of the league after 11 matches, and would ordinarily have seen the feel-good factor at a high. But within days, the club was enveloped in gloom. Jock Stein announced at a press conference immediately after the game that Hay had been suspended by the club after failing to report to the ground on Friday. But as late as Monday the 19th of November, the press were reporting that George Connelly would be back in the team for a midweek trip to Pittodrie in the League Cup after his rest on Saturday. By Tuesday, though, the news had broken that he had joined Hay in walking out on the club, and the Daily Record devoted a whole page to the crisis at Parkhead. Almost £500,000 worth of talent would stay in Glasgow that midweek, but the reasons for Connelly's walkout were still not clear. Ken Gallagher and Ian Broadley reported, "As Celtic travelled north, Connelly was at home in Blantyre, where he said, 'I will be making a statement later this week regarding my situation with the club. I have nothing to say about whether I will return to the club or my intentions.' Rumours persisted, however, that Connelly is determined to follow his close friend Hay in asking for a move. In his own column on the same page, Alex Cameron wrote, "What makes the Connelly blow-up all the more intriguing is that he is not even the type who wants to leave his own doorstep. Connelly, Hay and Macari are all international players. Are they influenced when they meet top Anglo players by talk of £150 basic wage packets in the south? At Parkhead, the players certainly don't receive anything like this as a basic, but I have good reason for saying that an average weekly pay packet of a player in the side this season has been about £240. This would include payments for midweek games and win bonuses." While money was a factor in Connelly's walkout, there was more to it than that, as Jock Stein hinted to Cameron. George is a different case from Davie Hay. You know he can be a complex character. Maybe he has some problems of his own. We are sitting on the situation at the moment to see what happens. We don't want to lose George, and we have to make a stand somewhere. He is not under suspension, but I talked to him. Connelly had basically come out in sympathy for his closest friend Hay, but how much his heart was really in it is open to question. He was back at Celtic Park by the end of the week and making himself available for selection. Ian Broadley reported in the Daily Record of the 23rd of November 1973. "He would say nothing of the reasons which caused him to walk out on the club, but there is now no question of him asking for a move." While Celtic are saying nothing either, their whole attitude to their vanishing star speaks volumes. They know Connelly is a complex character who is very much a loner among his Parkhead teammates. That is why Connelly was not suspended after his walkout, whereas his transfer-seeking international colleague Davie Hay was banned immediately he missed training. It is unlikely that the reasons for his walkout will ever be fully known. But Connelly, a shy, introverted type, despite the acclaim he has won through his undeniable talent, is a close friend of Davie Hay. The fact that Hay will shortly be leaving for Manchester United has probably upset him. He has also had differences with other players at Parkhead, which may have made him feel even more isolated. George Connelly's problems in November of 1973 went far beyond mere unhappiness with his Celtic wage packet. He remembers in his biography, Celtic's Lost Legend, written with Brian Cooney, that his marriage was breaking down and that he had begun drinking more than a professional footballer should have been. The walkout, short-lived though it was, marked the beginning of the end of his career, and while he remained on Celtic's books until October 1976, his best days were effectively over. There was still plenty of drama to come in the Celtic story of George Connelly, but very little of it concerned on-field matters. Tragic is probably too melodramatic a word to use to describe the disintegration of Connelly's career, but it's difficult to think of a more appropriate one. While Connelly came back into the fold quickly, Hay remained on strike for another 2 weeks until he was approached by journalist Jim Roger, a close confidant of Jock Stein's, and persuaded to call off his strike in time for the League Cup semi-final showdown against Rangers on the 5th of December 1973. He remembers in The Quiet Assassin. Jim was a bit of a Mr. Fix-It in the days before agents. He was involved in a lot of transfer deals, and I think he was behind Dennis Law's move to Manchester United from Italian side Torino, and the likes of Alan Gilzean to Spurs from Dundee and Ian Ure to Arsenal from the Dens Park outfit. He was fairly well connected. I respected him, and he turned up at my door one day to say, "It's time you were back playing. This is doing no one any good." He was right, of course. He conveyed the message that I was prepared to return to the fold. I was told to get down to Parkhead and prepare for the League Cup semi-final against Rangers on Wednesday the 5th of December. I thought I was ready to play, but feeling fit and being match fit are two different things, take my word for it. "You're in," I was told, and I duly turned out against our oldest rivals at our national stadium in a must-win game. While Hay was straight back into the team, Connelly was only on the bench, as was Jimmy Johnston, and neither of the substitutes would start a first-team match again before the spring, Pat McCluskey seizing his chance to claim Connelly's place, and Jinky seemingly out of favour with the manager. The Scottish League hired a private generator to get around the floodlight ban and enable an evening kick-off, and it was the kind of miserable midweek night that Hampden specialises in. John Rafferty wrote in The Scotsman of the 6th of December 1973, "There were 54,864 spectators at storm-swept Hampden Park to watch the affair, and if some consider that a sparse crowd, they should know about the conditions. There is nonsense, they say, and damned nonsense, and this match was the latter. Never can there have been a more misconceived occasion, and the wonder was that in such ridiculous conditions the players managed to produce a reasonable game of football. To start with, the generator-powered lights were dim, with both goals in shadows. Still, the lights were good enough to show the swirling rain from aft, which persisted throughout, dancing watery ballets across the field. It was a Disney fantasy." The first half was evenly contested, with Rangers, if anything, having the better of it, despite Celtic playing with the wind. But it was Celtic who opened the scoring on 35 minutes with a simple headed goal from Harry Hood. Rafferty reported, "Callahan struck a free kick low and hard. McLaughlin dropped it and Dalglish drove it against him. It broke out to Dalglish and he returned it coolly to Hood's head. He nodded the ball into the net." Rangers equalised 4 minutes later, with what Hugh Taylor in the Daily Record of the 6th of December described as a glorious goal, a terrific swerving shot that gave Alistair Hunter no chance. John Rafferty described it more prosaically in his report. "He threw a firm shot at the far post, and Hunter, without moving, let it pass across him and into the net near the post. They were level at half-time." Level at half-time, the feeling inside the stadium was that Rangers were now favourites, playing with the wind in the second half. But it turned out to be one of the most one-sided 45 minutes in the fixture for some time, and Harry Hood, the scorer of a magnificent hat-trick on the night, was only denied a unique place in Celtic history by a questionable offside flag. Hugh Taylor reported in the Daily Record, "In the second half, Rangers went to pieces with the wind. Or maybe it would be fairer to say that Celtic played neat, on-the-floor football." Hood's second goal was a near copy of the first, Billy McNeil heading Kenny Dalglish's free kick for goal and the ball breaking off McLaughlin for Hood to stab it home. This time there would be no quick equaliser for Rangers, and Hood completed his hat-trick after a flowing move involving Davie Hay and Tom Callahan saw Kenny Dalglish send him racing clear to neatly dink the ball over the outrushing McLaughlin. no Celtic player would score a hat-trick against a Rangers club again until Moussa Dembele in 2016. But Harry Hood is still part of a rather exclusive club of players who have scored hat-tricks against Rangers, including Jimmy Quinn, Jimmy Delaney, Malky MacDonald, Steve Chalmers and Bobby Lennox. Hood, though, should have found a place in the record books all of his own when he scored a fourth goal shortly after completing his hat-trick. Hugh Taylor reported, "It was all over when Hood completed his hat-trick after a fine move in 73 minutes. There was a suspicion of offside about the goal, but Rangers lost nothing. For Hood had the ball in the net for a fourth time, only to be ruled offside when he was obviously at least 2 yards onside." With Hay and Connelly back in the fold, and an emphatic win over Rangers on their return, everything seemed to be rosy in Celtic's garden again. Hugh Taylor wrote, "Against the wind they were in command and made Rangers look clumsy. Indeed, they should have won by an even more convincing margin. They did enough to show that they are still by far Scotland's best team, a team with class." The next two matches spoiled the feel-good factor again, as 3 days later, Connelly and Johnston were disappeared into the reserves, and at a snowbound Celtic Park, Dundee United grabbed a last-minute equaliser to draw 3-3 in the league, and on the 15th of December, the League Cup final was lost for the fourth year in succession, this time to Tommy Gemmell's Dundee. It was shaping up to be a grim winter off the pitch, with the energy crisis intensifying and the government banning the use of private generators to power floodlights. So the match had to kick off at 1:30pm in case of extra time being required. And in appalling weather conditions, less than 28,000 fans turned up for a match that both managers protested should have been postponed. Archie Macpherson writes in Jock Stein, the definitive biography, "On the 15th of December 1973, Stein stood with me just behind the cup presentation area of Hampden Park, surveying a bleak scene. His bête noire, referee Bobby Davidson, was out inspecting a very wet and soggy-looking pitch which had come under threat from the weather. It was during the period of the state of emergency caused by the miners' strike, so the kick-off time was 1:30 to avoid the use of floodlights. Stein was in a growling, dyspeptic mood. He liked the Tory government and what they were doing to the miners about as much as he did Bobby Davidson and the way he officiated Celtic matches. 'Look at that man,' he said to me as Davidson paced out the dicey pitch. 'This game should never be played. He knows this will make it a lottery. That's what he's got in mind. He's a bloody disgrace.' In the following day's Sunday Post, Bill McLaughlin wrote, "That game should never have been played. It was bad for the players and ridiculous for the fans. We complained before the game, but were forced to accept the ref's decision the park was playable. That, incredibly, is Davie White talking. The same Davie White who yesterday, in Arctic conditions, steered Dundee to glory in their first major cup success in 21 years. With sleet and rain falling throughout the match, the turf was bone hard underfoot, but coated in shallow mud, with standing water all over the pitch long before the end, which Jack Harkness wrote in the Sunday Post, ruined any chance this game had of being a classic cup final." As was becoming depressingly familiar in League Cup finals, Celtic's performance matched the weather, while by all accounts Dundee adapted better to the conditions, and with Tommy Gemmell, who was abused by a section of the Celtic support towards the end of the match, inspiring their defence, they deservedly took the lead on 74 minutes with a goal from Gordon Wallace, described with just a touch of hyperbole by Hugh Taylor in the Daily Record of the 17th of December 1973. "The Dundee attacker superbly breasted down the ball and swept it into the Celtic net past the helpless Alistair Hunter, just as Pelé did in his heyday." With 15 minutes still to go, the injured Harry Hood and Davie Hay were replaced by Connelly and Johnston, and Celtic started to look more threatening. Jack Harkness reported, "The Parkhead side began to look more dangerous than they had been all through. A Steve Murray header took the paint off the top of the bar. Then Johnston tumbled in the box mid great roars for a penalty. I thought it was a spot kick, until the Dundee men pointed out that Jimmy had been floored by one of his own players." The Daily Record of the 17th of December 1973 published 2 photos which appear to confirm that Jinky did indeed trip over Kenny Dalglish, who was moving in from the wing when he fell. The whole mood of the day can be summed up by Jock Stein's words to Bill McLaughlin for the Sunday Post. Disappointed. Very, very disappointed. As with the League Cup finals of 1970 and 1971, the defeat to Dundee would prove to be no more than a bump in the road as Celtic bounced back quickly. With no sign of George Connelly or Jimmy Johnston, 1973 was rounded off with 2 successive 6-0 victories over Falkirk and Dunfermline respectively at Celtic Park, with Dixie Deans scoring 6 goals over the 2 games. After a 2-0 win over Clyde at Shawfield on the 1st of January 1974, 9 in a row was virtually assured by a 1-0 victory over Rangers on the 5th of January. It was an utterly convincing win, despite the narrow margin of victory, Ian Archer reporting in the Glasgow Herald of the 7th of January 1974. Quietly, as if they always feared the worst, Rangers fans took the punishment like men. Hardly a word of encouragement, scarcely a hymn of defiance arose from the royal blue end of Parkhead. Their team came and were vanquished by Celtic. The scoreline looks marginal, but it lies. There was but one side playing football, the composed, intelligent and graceful Scottish game. The other was huffing and puffing, but had no chance of blowing down Jock Stein's castle. The only goal of the game came in the 27th minute and was the match in microcosm, Celtic winning the physical battle before showing their class. Don Morrison reported in the Sunday Mail of the 6th of January 1974. Stevie Murray, at last asserting himself in a Celtic jersey, started it by winning a tackle with Forsyth and pushing the ball to Dalglish. He in turn flashed it on to Hood running free on the right. Harry, with all the time in the world, looked up, saw Lennox running into the box and stuck the ball in front of his teammate. Lennox only had to prod the ball over the line for a simple score at a vital time. Offside? He looked all right to me. Rangers' Scottish Cup win over Celtic in May 1973, coming soon after their win over a Celtic team decimated by flu at the turn of the year, and the subsequent departure of Lou Macari, had led to press speculation on a turning of the tide, with forecasts that Rangers were once again a match for Celtic and ready to win back the league championship for the first time in a decade. But for Ian Archer, not a reporter given to hyperbole, the manner of Celtic's 4th victory in 5 matches over Rangers that season suggested their dominance of Scottish football could well go on indefinitely. After expounding on the gap in class between the two sides, Archer saw only gloom ahead for Rangers unless they abandoned a dearly held, long-standing tradition. There is a reason why Rangers cannot find players like Dalglish, McGrain, Hay and McCluskey. There is also good cause to believe that over the next few years, Celtic will continue to discover multitudes of young talent annually to defend their perennial title of champions. Most boys now want to play for them, as they are Scotland's premier team. Celtic will be only too pleased to acquire them, and when they go in search of them, they look at their ability alone. They have no need to ask that polite and discreet question about the school which the lad is attending, the pertinent inquiry which decides whether he would be suitable Rangers material or not. Given that Celtic's scouting system is so thorough, given too that English clubs are spending so much time and money on dragging schoolboys south, Rangers' future problems could be severe. With success breeding success, Celtic will increasingly find it easier to draw youngsters to Parkhead, and Rangers more difficult to persuade boys that Ibrox is a suitable place of apprenticeship. And so, with money hard to find for the transfer market, it is not difficult to assess which of Glasgow's clubs stands more chance of acquiring the next 10 championships. Few would have forecast at that point that Rangers would go on to win 3 of the next 4 championships, as the damned 70's finally caught up with Celtic in traumatic and near tragic fashion. The win over Rangers was achieved with George Connelly and Jimmy Johnston still confined to the subs bench, and the intensely introverted Connelly, who had not started a match since playing for Scotland against West Germany in November, was finding it increasingly difficult to cope with personal problems caused by a failing marriage, and, as he relates in Celtic's Lost Legend, he was increasingly turning to drink and gaining too much weight. As his problems mounted, Connelly handed in a transfer request at the beginning of February, and reports paint a heartbreaking picture of an increasingly isolated man in turmoil. Connelly was quoted by Ian Archer in the Glasgow Herald of the 4th of February 1974. "Pride is at stake. I feel I should be in the first team." Archer then quoted Jock Stein. "I didn't put Connelly out of the side. He dropped himself by staying away, and you don't drop someone who's playing well for you just because the other fellow wants back." That someone was Pat McCluskey, who had stepped into the breach when Connelly walked out and had given a string of impressive performances in the meantime, most notably in the league win over Rangers, after which he had been described by Archer as a warrior of a centre-back. Now Connelly's place in Scotland's World Cup squad was in doubt, Archer writing, "Willie Ormond surely would not take to Germany a reserve player, and there is no guarantee that the sweeper will return as long as McCluskey retains his form. A transfer seems the only alternative, especially as his Celtic teammates clearly prefer to play with his substitute. Connelly is an interesting man, someone worthy of sympathy. He is sensitive, a quality which rather separates him from many of his fellow professionals." In almost all of his writing on Connelly, Archer displayed a great deal of sympathy for the player, but on this occasion, even he found it difficult to fully defend him, continuing, "Sadly, in this dispute, he seems out of order, and a little more patience might have allowed him to regain his first team place and eventually the respect of his colleagues, who have increasingly found his behaviour rather taxing. No one likes a colleague who does not turn up for work, leaving others to carry the burden." Whether coincidentally or not, by the end of the week, Connelly was back in the side, making his first start for 4 months in a league match at Celtic Park against Dundee on the 10th of February 1974. Coming a week after a shock 3-2 defeat to Motherwell at Fir Park, Dundee continued to perplex Celtic, recording a 2-1 win in a match Celtic should have had sewn up after 10 minutes. Hugh Taylor reporting in the Sunday Mail of the 11th of February 1974. "Ken Dalglish was in magnificent form and, at the start, made one opportunity after another for a rampant Celtic side who lacked striking power." Having been 7 points ahead of Hibernian in early January, the defeats to Motherwell and Dundee left them only 3 points ahead and set up a crunch match at Easter Road on the 23rd of February 1974. Any assessment of Jock Stein's achievements at Celtic in the 1970s should take account of how far he was backed financially by the board to bring in the players required to supplement the Quality Street gang and the remnants of the Lisbon Lions, and the detail surrounding this match is illuminating. Since taking in £200,000 for Lou Macari in January 1973, Celtic had spent around £120,000 buying Ali Hunter, Andy Lynch and Steve Murray. In the week before the match, Stein signed Sheffield United and former Partick Thistle striker Jimmy Bone in a £25,000 deal. Bone had been a prolific scorer for Partick Thistle from 1968 to 1972, netting 50 times in 107 league matches, and had gained a full Scotland cap in the World Cup qualifying campaign, scoring in a 4-1 win over Denmark in Copenhagen on the 18th of October 1972. But he had found goals harder to come by at first Norwich City, then Sheffield United. His Celtic career would be brief, and he was sold to Arbroath for just £12,000 the following year. He was a very decent player and later became a thorn in Celtic's side in a successful 4-year stint at St Mirren from 1978 to 82. But his signing was emblematic of Celtic's recruitment policy in the early to mid-70s. Stein had once worked wonders on a tight budget, bringing in Joe McBride, Willie Wallace, Tom Callaghan, Harry Hood and Dixie Deans for modest sums. But Celtic could certainly have afforded to spend more, and the question might be asked, was Stein reluctant to pay higher transfer fees, or would the board simply not sanction it? The answer could well be both, but it's certain that Chairman Desmond White kept a notoriously tight grip on the purse strings. Earlier in the season, Stein had wanted to sign Ian Phillip from Crystal Palace and the Scottish League's top scorer in 1972-73, John Duncan from Dundee. Phillip returned to Dundee for just over £40,000 and played in their League Cup final win over Celtic, while Duncan, who also played in the final, signed for Spurs in a £140,000 deal in October 1974. To put Celtic's spending in context, Hibernian that day had their record signing at £120,000, Joe Harper on the bench. Harper endured an unhappy spell at Easter Road, never really recapturing the form that prompted Hibs to splash out that kind of money, but he would later go on to enjoy a very successful second stint at Aberdeen and was part of the Scotland World Cup squad in Argentina in 1978. There certainly were very good Scottish players available for Celtic to buy in the early 70s, if there had been any willingness from within the club to pay the money required. Celtic's ropey spell of form in early 1974 was not ended at Easter Road on the 23rd of February, but their 4-2 win all but made 9 in a row a certainty. Once again, Dixie Deans was the hammer of the Hibs, scoring goals in the first and last minutes, with Kenny Dalglish and Paul Wilson grabbing the others to set them up for a European Cup quarter-final tie against Basel in Switzerland 4 days later. This was Celtic's third European tie against the Swiss side since 1963, and with Jimmy Johnston still out of favour and Bobby Lennox injured, Billy McNeill was the only survivor of the first two meetings and the only Lisbon Lion in the side. It was also the first match missed that season by the injured Ali Hunter, already a Scotland international when he signed from Kilmarnock a year before, but who was going through a crisis of confidence after losing a bad goal on the night Scotland beat Czechoslovakia in September 1973. Since then, his performances had never really matched the standards he set before that night, and he was replaced by Evan Williams, making his first appearance of the season, and it turned out to be a nightmare for the former number one, who never played for the first team again. Playing under floodlights for the first time in 3 months, it looked as though Celtic might achieve their aim of winning the tie in the first leg, when an impressive first 20 minutes was capped by a truly spectacular Paul Wilson volley from 12 yards. Ian Archer reported in the Glasgow Herald of the 28th of February 1974. Celtic took the lead after 20 minutes, following a whole series of sweeping attacks on the Basel goal. Brogan, moving down the left, crossed orthodoxly into the penalty area, and Wilson met the ball on the drop to hit it with such stupendous power that the Swiss goalkeeper, Laufenberger, was still puzzled minutes later. All the good work was undone when the Swiss mounted their first attack of the match on 28 minutes. Hugh Taylor reporting in the Daily Record of the 28th of February. A shot from 18 yards by Otmar Hitzfeld didn't seem all that difficult. Poor Evan Williams, however, got his hands to it, failed to hold it, and closed his eyes in horror as it rolled over the line. This was the boost Basel needed. The pattern of play was turned on its head, and minutes later, Basel captain Karl Odermatt put them ahead with a thunderbolt of a free kick from distance, which completely caught Williams unawares as it raged into the net.
Odermatt certainly has a long run here. Here he comes. There goes a beauty, and it's there! What a goal!
Paul Wilson grazed the base of the post with a shot minutes before the interval as the visitors recovered their poise, and Kenny Dalglish scored Celtic's 100th European goal on 54 minutes. The goal owed much to the drive and determination of Danny McGrain, surging forward from the right and heading across the box. After an attempted 1-2 with Kenny Dalglish rebounded back off a defender's foot, he pounced to divert it into the path of Dalglish, who flicked it beautifully over the keeper's head with the outside of his right foot to drop in at the far post.
in the 12th minute of the second half. And no player deserves it more. A beautifully worked goal. Ball stopped waiting for a flag or a whistle. It never came. Danny McGrain sticking it through. Ball not getting it away. Dalglish obviously onside. Ball didn't realise that he was. Flicked it in beautifully.
Only 9 minutes later, Basel took the lead again, and again Evan Williams looked none too clever. His drop kick under no pressure, falling right to the feet of Otto Demermels, who ran 30 yards and played a 1-2 that sent him into the box, running away from goal on the left-hand side. As George Connelly chased him, the two came together and the Basel player fell, the referee awarding a soft penalty, which Hitzfeld shot high into the top corner.
Superbly struck, a right foot shot, giving Evan Williams.
Defeat in Switzerland was a disappointment, but Celtic were still expected to advance to the semi-finals without too much trouble, although maybe the events of the second leg shouldn't have come as such a surprise. Hugh Taylor wrote, "With away goals counting double, Celtic may feel that they are in a strong position for the return game at Parkhead, but they will not underestimate the striking power of Basel, who remain the leading scorers in this year's European Cup with 21 goals. Before the return leg came around, there was a welcome return to the side for Jimmy Johnston, who had barely played since making a substitute appearance in the League Cup final. Jinky returned in a league match against Ayr United on the 16th of March 1974, when Celtic wore their green and black striped away kit for the first time, which was met, at best, with a mixed reception. Enough of a fuss was caused that it was commented on by Alex Cameron in the Daily Record of the 18th of March 1974. Celtic turned out in a modern new strip of black and green vertical stripes at Parkhead on Saturday, and this continental touch caused fierce argument among the fans. The traditionalists didn't like it, but the mods did, and so did I. Don't be surprised if Celtic wear it again soon. It's up to the minute, in the Inter Milan style, but it's also historical. Remember Aberdeen and East Fife, for instance, turning out in amber and black vertical stripes? The main talking point of the game, though, was Johnston's impish performance, which delighted the crowd. Hugh Taylor wrote in the Daily Record of the 18th of March 1974, "Johnston, back after his long absence, was the darling of the 26,000 crowd. What can you say of this brilliant wee entertainer when he's on this form? Superb! Certainly, if Basel had sent a spy to Parkhead, he'd have gone home worried sick, and wondering why Jimmy didn't play in the first leg. Johnston can be the secret weapon to complete the destruction of Basel." Johnston scored 2 goals, both from the penalty spot, after Billy McNeill took the hugely popular decision to hand him the responsibility on his return, and his every touch was wildly applauded by his adoring fans. Ian Archer in the Glasgow Herald suggested it had been a make-or-break day for Jinky, and hinted at the behind-the-scenes problems that had kept him out of the team for so long. In the dressing room, as well as the terraces, Jimmy demands forgiveness. He is not, shall we say, as reliable a person as most bank managers, but he remains everyone's favourite, for he is spry and sharp and likeable. As he bounced out of Parkhead yesterday, he beamed. Jock Stein beamed back. He's worth all the trouble. Stein now has to make the decision as to whether he will play against Basel. A brave Ormond might just yet have to make the decision whether he will play for Scotland. Unfortunately for Celtic's European Cup hopes, while Johnston was back, Danny McGrain had been injured in a league match at Celtic Park against Hearts on the 2nd of March, and he would miss the return with Basel and the first leg of the semi-final against Atletico Madrid. And their injury problems weren't finished yet. Just 5 minutes into the return match against Basel on the 20th of March 1974, George Connelly broke his ankle and would not play again until August. Ian Archer reported in the Glasgow Herald of the 21st of March, "A short ball from Johnston left Connelly with an awkward stretch. He shuddered to the ground, hurt badly, and was carried from the field, seriously injured." Pat McCluskey came on to replace Connelly, and Celtic stormed into the attack, having 2 goals disallowed before Kenny Dalglish opened the scoring with a header to level the tie on 13 minutes. 4 minutes later, they looked set for a routine win, Dixie Deans finishing off a flowing move involving Harry Hood and Steve Murray. Hugh Taylor reported in the Daily Record of the 21st of March 1974, Basel seemed to be on their knees, reeling under majestic and beautifully organised Celtic raids. As in the first game in Switzerland, it seemed only a matter of time until Celtic rattled up the cricket score. Frustratingly, just as in Switzerland, poor defending brought Basel not only level by half-time, but ahead again on aggregate. First, the free kick into the box was not dealt with, and Walter Munson headed in. Then yet another goalkeeping blunder in the dying seconds of the first half made it 2-2 on the night. Hugh Taylor wrote, as the first half went into extra time because of injuries and delays, Rahman struck swiftly. He cut in and shot, and once again a Celtic goalkeeper blundered. Dennis Conaghan failed to hold the ball and, alas for him, merely touched it out to Barmer, who had the easiest of jobs in netting. The second 45 minutes was intensely frustrating for Celtic, who dominated proceedings but had lost their earlier fluency and missed several chances. Tom Callaghan squared the tie on 57 minutes with a tremendous volleyed goal, but there was no more scoring, and with a 3-2 win apiece, extra time was required to separate the teams. Celtic stormed into the attack again, and Jimmy Johnston and Dixie Deans had both missed good chances before they finally went in front again in the 98th minute. John Rafferty reported in the Scotsman of the 21st of March 1974, Dalglish and Hood again worked out an intricate move, and Hood's cross flew to the far post. Johnston jumped and challenged, but the ball was knocked out to Murray, and with his forehead he directed it away from the keeper, and a desperate defender, trying to punch clear, could only send it into the roof of the net. Everybody knew then, and it seemed that the tired players agreed, that Celtic were through. The celebrations on the terraces were wild, but tinged with more than a hint of relief after what had been an unexpected rollercoaster against the unfancied Swiss champions. For Jock Stein, though, all of it was overshadowed by the devastating injury suffered by George Connelly. Hugh Taylor wrote in the Daily Record, a gloomy Jock Stein told me, the news about George's fracture has taken all the happiness away from victory. OK, we've won and we're in the semi-finals, but right now for me, that's secondary to George. I don't know exactly how it happened. He stretched for a ball, and I think maybe someone caught his foot. Anyway, the ankle is broken, and George is out for the rest of the season. He won't be playing for us again, and obviously, he won't be ready for the World Cup in the summer. It's a tragedy. For all the frustration Stein must have felt as Connolly's career disintegrated, and all the problems caused by his walkouts before and after his broken ankle, his affection and concern for the player is clear. While many players would find themselves on the end of a withering blast from their manager for their indiscretions, Connolly never was. Stein went far more than the extra mile with Connolly, demonstrating both his understanding of and sympathy for the player's problems, and also the value he placed on his importance to the team. Connolly represented Stein's hopes for the future, the man to replace Billy McNeill in the centre of defence, and the player to build what he thought would be his new Celtic around. Celtic were through to their fourth European Cup semi-final, their second in 3 years. Before they played Inter Milan in 1972, injury robbed them of two key players, depriving them of Danny McGrain's relentless overlapping runs from fullback and the drive of Davie Hay in midfield. As if to confirm that the football fates were conspiring against the club in the 1970s, they would once again be missing McGrain on that infamous night in April 1974 when the thugs of Atletico Madrid came calling, and arguably, even more importantly, the much-needed class and composure of Connolly. A 1-0 win over Arbroath on the 6th of April 1974 saw Celtic 4 points ahead of Rangers with a game in hand, and 3 wins and a draw in their next 4 matches would see them clinch 9 in a row at Brockville days after the second leg in Madrid. Danny McGrain played in the win over Arbroath, his first appearance since his injury on the 2nd of March, but he was still not fully fit and was only named as a substitute for the first leg of the semi-final. Fears had already been voiced about how Atletico would approach the tie, centring on their Argentinian coach Juan Carlos Lorenzo, who had been in charge of the Argentina side at the 1966 World Cup, branded as animals by Alf Ramsey after their ill-tempered quarter-final clash. Jock Stein had tried to play down these fears in the build-up, stressing how disciplined Atletico had been when he watched them play, although the very fact it was being spoken about shows that the behaviour of their players was not entirely unexpected. Quoting the Celtic manager, Ian Archer wrote in the Glasgow Herald the day before the match, "In my time, I can remember only the one bad match. True, it was against Racing of the Argentine, but it was played in another continent, and things were different. In Europe, I can't remember many incidents. We've played both the Milan clubs, and they have a reputation for ruthlessness, but on those occasions there was no trouble. That should be a fair indication of the way we handle ourselves. And in this semi-finals, I have no fears. There was nothing about the Atletico play in the match we both saw last week to cause any concern, was there? The Spaniards looked disciplined and did not panic. That's important, for it's panic that makes games go astray." That, I think, is a fair assessment of a situation which needs cooling. The Argentinian influence in this team is strong, but surely it's wrong to carry on a long vendetta because of the events of the last decade. The normally perceptive Archer had probably missed the mark. Neither Juan Carlos Lorenzo nor any of the Argentinians in his side had a particular grudge against Celtic. They were simply as utterly unscrupulous as they were ruthless, and therefore prepared to use any means, at any cost, to get past Celtic and into the final. It was nothing personal, just business. The Atletico side that Stein had watched bore no resemblance at all to the team they sent out at Celtic Park with the aim of escaping with a 0-0 draw, and with a display of blatant thuggery they achieved it. It might all have been so different if the referee had not disallowed what looked like a perfectly good goal for Celtic after only 10 minutes. Steve Murray sent Harry Hood scampering after the ball to the byline on the left side of the box, and he turned it low across goal for Kenny Dalglish to tap in. But the far side linesman raised his flag to signal the ball had gone out before Hood crossed. Photographic evidence suggests he was very probably wrong, and it was a huge call to make from where he was positioned on the other side of the pitch. Had that goal stood, Atletico's game plan might not have changed much. They'd still have settled for a 1-0 defeat, but it would have given Celtic a huge boost and 80 minutes to add more. Sadly, it was not to be. 3 minutes before Dalglish's disallowed goal, the referee had issued the first yellow card of the match to Atletico's star striker Ruben Ayala, ironically for a fairly innocuous incident when he tried to snatch the ball out of Dennis Conaghan's hands. A minute later, Diaz was booked for scything down Jimmy Johnston, but the referee then took no action for a similar foul by Eusebio on Kenny Dalglish. The referee had an almost impossible job, and short of abandoning the match, there was probably little more he could have done to keep Atletico in order, and even before proceedings erupted in the second half, the match had already been ruined as a spectacle. John Rafferty wrote in The Scotsman of the 11th of April 1974, "Johnston was lucky when Benegas missed him with a vicious kick, for he might have landed in the Royal Infirmary. He was not so fortunate when he was hacked down by Diaz, and then Benegas did strike down Hood. From the free kick, McNeil was mere inches away from the ball with his head. The game became a pathetic occasion, far from what we had hoped, and in their desperate clearances from the penalty area, the Spaniards were not worrying who they hit with the ball in the stand. There was a fair bit of football being played in the middle of the field, and particularly by Dalglish, but we were distracted by the nastiness this team had brought to the game." The Turkish referee did not show a red card until after the hour mark, and when it came, it was for a relatively innocuous foul, given the type of challenges he had allowed to go unpunished beforehand. Possibly the most brutal foul on a night of brutality received only a yellow card on 53 minutes when Jimmy Johnston, taking a short free kick on the left wing, jinked past Argentinian defender Ruben Diaz, who had played for Racing Club against Celtic in the World Club Championship in 1967. Johnston was confronted by a second defender, while Diaz repeatedly kicked him from behind. ongoing past the second defender, Paraguayan centre-half Domingo Benegas, lunged in and took Johnston down with a boot in the groin. Even in 1974, this should have been a straight red card, but the referee chose only to caution him. The first red card of the night was shown to Ayala, who lunged into a challenge from behind on Davie Hay near the halfway line, and having already been booked, was sent off for a second offence.
It's going to be a free kick. Now, what is happening to Ayala? He's already been cautioned, and Ayala is being sent off. Ayala is sent off. And really, it was bound to happen sooner or later that somebody is going to be sent off. And he was sent off for that piece of tackling there.
Seconds later, Diaz was sent off for a blatant kick on Jimmy Johnston after he had wrong-footed him and made for the byline. John Rafferty reported, "In the next minute, Diaz kicked Johnston once again, and since he had already had a caution, he was ordered off too, and the indiscriminate Spaniards had got their just desserts and were reduced to 9 men. Quickly, they showed they were going to be 9 defenders. They packed their penalty area, leaving no one up, and set Celtic to batter at that wall of players."
Atletico Madrid side, and 2 of them now have been sent off the field.
Lorenzo then made 2 substitutions, taking off Garratti and Iriruta, both of whom had been booked, and the kicking and hacking continued. The ironically named Francisco Melo booked for another assault on Johnston. Celtic could create no more than half chances against this wall of flying boots and came close with headers from Harry Hood and Kenny Dalglish. Hood's header dropping just the wrong side of the post, while the keeper clutched Dalglish's effort with a save that looked a lot more spectacular than it really was. The recently introduced Kike was the third player sent off, this time a straight red card when he booted the ball clear just in front of Jimmy Johnston, then booted Jinky for good measure after the ball was gone.
Involving Jimmy Johnston, and the Atletico Madrid player is down, and I think when he gets up he's going to find a bit of a punishment, because the Turkish referee has already got his hands. It's the number 12 Kikwe. I think it's what, oh look at him having a go at Jimmy Johnston way after that ball had gone. And he is off! And he is off as well! So that is the 3rd Atletico Madrid player to go. Wide on one side.
The final whistle was greeted with delirium by Atletico, substitutes and backroom staff flooding onto the pitch in celebration as if they had won the tournament. And as they finally made their way off, the storm that had been threatening all night finally broke. Ken Gallagher and Alex Cameron reported on the front page of the Daily Record of the 11th of April 1974. More than 73,000 fans watched in disbelief as Atletico and Celtic players threw punches seconds after the end of a cup tie that produced no goals, but unprecedented scenes of violence. And early today, there was speculation that those vicious scenes could see the Spanish side banned from the competition. The whistle for full-time had hardly died away when one of the Spaniards, Eusebio, ran at Celtic's Jimmy Johnston and punched him. Manager Jock Stein was caught in the middle of the melee as players from both sides leaped at one another. Police moved in immediately. 2 officers grabbed Eusebio, and as he struggled to get free, he was grabbed by the hair and pushed up the tunnel as if under arrest.
Celtic players and Atletico players were involved, and a most disgraceful night of football gets a really seamy final full stop. A match of 50 free kicks, 9 cautions.
Film of the incident does not give a clear picture of what actually went on as the players brawled on the sidelines and on the way back up the tunnel, but James Sanderson reported in the Daily Mirror the following day. As Celtic winger Jimmy Johnston stepped onto the track from the field, he was viciously smashed in the stomach by the powerful, dark-skinned Eusebio, not the famous Portuguese star. At once there was a maelstrom of fists and boots as Spanish players attacked Celtic. The bewildered Scots gathered around Johnston, semi-conscious on the ground, and fought off the Spaniards while police rushed in, watched by 73,000 horror-struck fans. Still, the Spaniards kept fighting furiously, calling for teammates to join them. Celtic manager Jock Stein, towering over everyone, plunged into the battle, calling for help for his men. It's fair to say that scores were settled by several of the Celtic team, with not just the approval, but the assistance of Glasgow's finest. Davie Hay remembers in The Quiet Assassin, "Deep in the tunnel, away from prying eyes, I decided to exact some retribution for my wee pal. I got involved, for want of a better word, with a couple of their players, and punches were thrown. I could hear one of them squealing, and by the time I reached the dressing room, I had a clump of someone's hair in my fist. I wonder how that got there." Dixie Deans adds a bit more to Hay's recollection in his own biography, There's Only One Dixie Deans, written with Ken McNabb. "I turned round to see fists flailing and punches raining in all over the place, and right in the middle was Davy, who had decided on a senior moment to carry out his own form of retribution. I remember him squaring up to Ayala, one of those who had been sent off, and what happened next was almost comical. One of Glasgow's finest, a huge bear of a policeman, got involved, but instead of pulling the players apart, held the Spaniard up, pinned back his arms, and told Davy to take his best shot. No second invitation was needed, but when I saw what was happening, I immediately thought, I'll have some of that. I waded in with a few right hooks of my own. So a big thank you to the cop who turned a blind eye. Ayala got what he deserved, but the whole thing still left a bitter taste. At times like that though, it was great to have Davy in your corner, and there was nothing quiet about him." Atletico laughably tried to blame the referee and, in the words of their president Vicente Calderon, his crazy decisions for everything that happened. And by the weekend, the press in Scotland were reporting on allegations emerging from Spain that the Atletico Madrid players had been beaten mercilessly by Glasgow police. The Scotsman of the 13th of April 1974 reported, "Carlos Rodrigo, the team masseur, said, 'They beat us without mercy in the tunnel.' He asserted that at least 5 of the players were badly beaten. Benegas was hit by police from all directions and suffered multiple bruises. Eusebio, he said, was hit several times in the mouth, and Bermejo limped into the dressing room with his lip split. He wanted to go to the defence of Diaz, and 2 policemen grabbed him, while another 2 beat him without mercy and brutally," Rodrigo said. Diaz, one of the players sent off, was kicked from behind by a Celtic player as he headed for the dressing room, he said. Another Atletico player, Benegas, told reporters that a Celtic official had taken a swing at him, but he ducked. Other players also claimed to have been in a punch-up with Celtic officials and players off the pitch. These allegations were denied, the Scotsman report continuing. "Replying to the allegations last night, Glasgow Chief Constable Mr McNee said no complaint was made to the senior police officer in charge at Parkhead at the time, either by an official or player of the Spanish team. In fact, the opposite was true. They complimented the police on their handling of the situation. I do not know what motives there can be for such allegations at this late stage. If complaints were justified, they should have been made at the time," Mr McNee said. No one took the allegations seriously at the time, but it appears there might have been some substance to them after all. Sympathy for Atletico, though, would be in as short supply now as it was then. There were calls for Celtic to refuse to travel to Madrid for the away leg, and the Scottish press were fairly unanimous in their calls for UEFA to award Celtic the tie. Ian Archer wrote in the Glasgow Herald on the 11th of April 1974, "Atletico Madrid dishonoured Spain last night and disgraced the proud traditions of the European Cup. They should neither be allowed back into Scotland nor given entry to this tournament again. UEFA should act today and award this semi-final to Celtic, for they were the victims disciplined enough not to retaliate. They were the blameless ones. As the floodlights dim, one's mind reels at this disgraceful semi-final." John Rafferty, meanwhile, wrote in The Scotsman, I claim emphatically that Celtic must not be asked to go to Madrid for the second game, and that any team which has 3 players ordered off and another 5 cautioned are not fit company for this competition and should be tossed out of it forthwith. There was probably never any real possibility that Atletico would be kicked out of the competition, and Celtic inevitably had to travel to Madrid. There would be little thuggery from Atletico this time. They had achieved their objective at Celtic Park, but they hadn't turned into sporting Corinthians and still pulled every trick in the book to put Celtic off their game. It started before Celtic even landed in Madrid on an Aer Lingus charter flight on Monday the 22nd of April. Before take-off, a message was received from Spain that the plane could not fly directly to Madrid. Ken Gallagher reported in the Daily Record of the 23rd of April 1974. Instead, Celtic's chartered Aer Lingus plane was forced to fly first to Dublin. Reason for the early morning order from the Spaniards? A plane must leave from or visit its native country before heading for Spain. But until the Spanish Airport Authority sent their reroute message, nobody in either Dublin or Glasgow had ever heard of the regulation. The rerouting put almost 2.5 hours extra flying time onto the plane's schedule and stress of an extra landing and take-off on the players. A spokesman for Aer Lingus Operations Control in Dublin said, "We've flown charters to Spain from Scotland before and never had this happen to us." On arrival in Spain, Celtic were greeted by a company of heavily armed police who were their constant shadows everywhere they went, ostensibly for their protection, but with a definite air of menace, as well as smiling, obsequious, very over-friendly Atletico officials, prompting an exasperated Jock Stein to mutter under his breath, "How can they be so two-faced?" Having requested travelling fans cancel their charter flights and stay at home, it was a very isolated Celtic party that faced hostility wherever they went in Madrid. Ken Gallagher reported in the Daily Record of the 24th of April 1974. Riot police chased 100 jeering and spitting demonstrators from Celtic's luxury hotel in Madrid yesterday. The Spaniards, mostly students, had followed the Celtic team back to the hotel in a noisy motorcade. As the team bus arrived in front of the Hotel Monte Royal, the players were quickly hustled inside. Meanwhile, the demonstrators, who had followed the Celtic party from a nearby training ground, began jeering and spitting on the coach. It was then that grey uniformed riot police, on permanent guard at the hotel, and the armed mobile patrol escorting Celtic swooped. They set about the demonstrators and drove them off. And last night, as extra police mounted guard on the hotel, manager Jock Stein announced his own security measures. He said no Celtic official or player would be allowed to leave the hotel until tonight's European Cup semi-final with Atletico Madrid. "It would be asking for trouble after what happened today if the players went out alone," said Stein, "and I'm taking no chances." Unpleasant and disruptive it may be, but fans creating a racket outside a team's hotel to disturb their sleep is far from uncommon. In Madrid, though, it took a darker turn when Jimmy Johnston received a death threat in the early hours of the morning on the day of the match. Davie Hay remembers in The Quiet Assassin. "Their fans discovered which hotel we were staying in, and they kept up a steady drumbeat for hours throughout the night. They also got a hold of the telephone number in the room Jinky was sharing with Bobby Lennox. Apparently, Jinky's face went chalk white when he answered a call in the early hours of the morning. 'Bobby!' he shouted, putting on the bedside lamp. 'Bobby, they're going to shoot me!' Someone had threatened to kill him. Now, Jinky was as brave as anyone I have ever met, but he was more than just a little perturbed that he had just received a death threat. Who could blame him? He went to Big Jock to relay the news, and our manager smiled and said, 'Ah, they've threatened me too. At least you can go out there and run about. I'm a sitting target in the dugout.' Whether a genuine threat or not, in the febrile atmosphere of Madrid, it seemed only too real, and Johnston took to the field, genuinely fearing that he could be the target of an assassination attempt. His fears would not have been allayed in the slightest as Celtic arrived at a stadium that resembled more the scene of a battlefield than a football match. Ian Archer described it in the Glasgow Herald of the 25th of April 1974. "The ground was under siege by the militia, and the arrival of the Scottish champions was the time when Madrid's latent hostility, sensed these last few days, came to the surface. Spaniards whistled and jeered angrily as mounted police kept them back from the team as it left the coach. 30 minutes before kick-off, Jock Stein took his players onto the pitch and they were met by a wall of noise. Every move they made was jeered and whistled as the police rose to their feet, sensing that good order was about to end. The security officials waved the Scots back into the dressing rooms after only 3 minutes of their pre-match routines. This was all a cruel imposition on a team that should not have been asked to expose themselves to such dangers. The manager looked angry, the players bemused, and how could football survive this long evening? That, as the fans pestered us in the press box with klaxon horns, seemed to be the question. In the circumstances, it's remarkable that Celtic put up such a good showing in Madrid. They had faced days of hostility and intimidation and were forced to play without the benefit of a pre-match warm-up, yet with a little luck they might have scored more than once in the first half. Ian Archer reported, "Their tactics were studious and cautious. They left Lennox and Johnston upfield, fed them with long balls and then tried to funnel auxiliary attackers in behind them. Inside that framework they were, throughout the first half, the better semi-finalists." After 12 minutes, a Bobby Lennox cross was headed inches over the bar by Billy McNeil, and Celtic came even closer 3 minutes later when the overlapping Danny McGrain crossed for Kenny Dalglish to strike a shot low and hard that was sent around the post by a fingertip save from the keeper. Midway through the half, Bobby Lennox ran on to a long clearance that caught the Atletico defence out, but with the keeper racing out of his box, Lennox's touch carried the ball too far wide and his shot drifted past. Archer wrote, "The impression throughout the first half was that Celtic were the better side, but needed a goal to establish that authority and guard against the occasional Atletico breakaway. That menace was seen 4 minutes before the interval, when again Capon came upfield, cut inside McCluskey, and then drove a shot from an easy position wide of the near post." John Rafferty in The Scotsman of the 25th of April agreed with Archer's assessment, and his report suggests that the nastiness had been taken out of the Atletico approach along with the thugs banned from the first leg. As half-time approached, the game, to the astonishment of most, had developed into a fascinating contest, sporting and with handshakes exchanged after tumbles, and one began to wonder what it was all about. Near half-time, Atletico might have scored. The fullback, Capon, got through on the right with a good look at goal, but his shot passed outside a post. Against that, Hood and Lennox were close to crosses in the Spanish goal area, and at half-time, were a points decision being given, it would have gone to Celtic. The second half began in a similar vein, with Jimmy Johnston heading over the bar and Kenny Dalglish taking too long to get his shot away from a good position in the box. But this marked the end of Celtic's dominance, and for the rest of the match, Atletico were in the ascendancy, and only grim defending and brilliant goalkeeping kept them in it. John Rafferty writing, "Conaghan came through as a great goalkeeper and McNeil and McCluskey were masterly. But there was a lack of sharpness in the midfield and throughout the game an inclination to bypass that area with long passes, and the well-organised Atletico defence was not to be caught out in that way." The defence was finally breached 12 minutes from the end, Garate turning a low cross into the net from close range. From somewhere, Celtic found new reserves of energy. John Rafferty writing, "The stadium came alight again to proclaim the score, and strangely, so too did Celtic. Dalglish found a new spark and got good backing from Murray and Hay, and they went after the goal they needed for victory. Any scoring draw was enough for them. But that Celtic pressure came to nothing, and then with 4 minutes to go, Atletico scored again. Adelardo found himself clear, and he beat Conaghan with a swerving shot. It was all over then. The Spanish had won, but justice had not been done." Now they had won the victory they were prepared to go to any lengths to achieve, the Atletico players and their rabid crowd actually saluted Celtic's efforts, but still the odious Juan Carlos Lorenzo showed his true colours. Rafferty reported, "He continued in his nasty ways to the end, and after the final whistle, when Celtic took a bow in the middle of the field and the Atletico players joined in the applause and made efforts at fraternising, he waved them away." No one could have guessed it at the time, but that match in Madrid in April 1974 marks the end of Celtic's time as genuine European contenders. Never again would they come so close to a third European Cup final, and this makes it all the more frustrating that the opportunity was denied by a team of brutal thugs who were allowed to ruin the home leg and were rewarded for their efforts with what amounted to a one-leg play-off at home and eventually a place in the final. Celtic departed the scene of the crime quickly and were back in Glasgow in the early hours of the morning. The back page of the Daily Record of the 25th of April 1974 captures the sense of shock and bitterness in the Celtic party on their return from their nightmare trip to Madrid. In the Celtic dressing room shortly after the game, Stein said, "I am not as disappointed as I would normally be. We came here as sacrifices. It's as simple as that. If we had won, it would have been a miracle. We had to come here as sacrifices to the European Union. The point is that Atletico are through, and as far as I'm concerned, the European Union deserve to have them in the final. I have no complaints about tonight's game on the field. We lost and that's that. The damage was done in Glasgow. Not just to Celtic, but to football." At 3 a.m, when Celtic flew into Glasgow Airport, they were greeted by the first friendly faces of fans who had stayed up to welcome them home. Two of the supporters had even paid £10 for a taxi fare from Broxburn, West Lothian, to greet the team. Celtic players and officials were clapped and cheered as they hurried through the airport. First out of the customs area was Chairman Mr Desmond White, who said, "We came off the park with honours, but naturally we are disappointed." Between the first and second legs against Atletico, 3 wins over Dundee United, East Fife and Aberdeen left Celtic requiring only a point from their remaining 3 league matches to clinch 9 in a row. This was duly achieved 3 days later with a 1-1 draw at Falkirk on the 27th of April 1974. Falkirk needed a win to avoid relegation and took a shock lead after only 3 minutes as Celtic struggled to shake off their European Cup hangover. The match was levelled by a superb Kenny Dalglish goal described by Dixon Blackstock of the Sunday Mail on the 28th of April 1974. In the 19th minute, Kenny picked up a rebound at the edge of the penalty box. A wall of Falkirk defenders lined up in front of him. Kenny feinted left, feinted right, and came back left again, peeling the defence like a banana. Then he calmly cracked a low left foot shot into the corner of the net. Sheer genius. The draw at Falkirk gave Celtic a world record equalling 9th championship in a row. But looking at the faces of the Celtic players on their lap of honour afterwards gives no hint that they were in a joyful mood in what was a moment of history. Trauma rather seems to be etched on their faces as they struggled to come to terms with the manner of their European Cup exit. A week later, the double was secured with a low-key 3-0 win over Dundee United, making their first ever appearance in the final of the Scottish Cup, and who froze on the big occasion, meaning Celtic barely needed to get out of third gear to win. The match was over as a contest after 25 minutes, after Harry Hood headed a lobbed pass from Dixie Deans over the outrushing United keeper Sandy Davie, and then Steve Murray doubled the lead with a cool finish when the ball broke to him in the penalty box. Danny McGrain, who was ill before the match, was replaced by Tom Callaghan in the second half, and in the final minutes he sent Kenny Dalglish running in on goal with a brilliant long ball. Dalglish turned the ball on to Dixie Deans and he guided the ball past the keeper and a couple of defenders on the goal line to seal the win. There was some controversy over the Celtic players doing a lap of honour before the trophy presentation, circumventing the SFA ban on laps of honour with the trophy, a rule which had been brought in after Rangers fans attacked the victorious Celtic players at the end of the 1965 League Cup final. Davie Hay, perhaps conscious that the clock was ticking down on his time at Celtic, looks pensive as the players celebrate the 5th League and Scottish Cup double for Celtic in Jock Stein's 9 full seasons in charge to that date. The Scottish Cup final was the only match Celtic won after returning from Madrid, the rest being drawn, and Davie Hay played his last competitive match for Celtic 2 days later against Morton at Capello, an unglamorous setting for a nondescript, meaningless match in which Celtic went through the motions in a dreary scoreless draw. Alex Cameron, in an equally cursory match report for the Daily Record of the 7th of May 1974, was writing about a Morton substitution, Jim O'Donnell making his debut in place of Hugh McElmoyle, leaving the Capello pitch for the last time, having been given a free transfer. But he could have been writing about Hay when he said, "It was an unkind way to go, but an even worse match in which to arrive." Young O'Donnell did have the consolation that for him the boredom lasted only 12 minutes, and then the referee thankfully brought the miserable proceedings to an end. There was still a 4-1 win over Liverpool in Ron Yates' testimonial match to come a week later, in which Bobby Charlton turned out and scored in a guest appearance for Celtic. But the match at Capello brought down the curtain on a season which effectively brought the glory years of the Stein era to an end. Never again would Celtic contend seriously for the European Cup, and a workman like Rangers would win 3 of the next 4 league championships with a team that was not a patch on the great Celtic sides of the early 1970s. For Davie Hay and teammates Danny McGrain, Kenny Dalglish and Jimmy Johnston, the World Cup finals in West Germany beckoned, and before that, home internationals against Wales and England, and a series of warm-up matches before Scotland's campaign got underway on the 14th of June. Johnston's return to form had been as welcome as it was unexpected after his fall from favour before the turn of the year, and he should have been one of the stars of the World Cup that summer. Unfortunately, while Scotland boss Willie Ormond was a great tactician and knew how to set up a team, he was totally unable to control his players off the field, and a Scotland party in those days really was a party. After the 2-0 victory over Wales at Hampden on the night of the 14th of May 1974, the team went back to their headquarters in Largs, and a group of jubilant Scotland players went out to celebrate, making their way back to the team hotel in the early hours of the morning of the 15th of May. As the revellers tried to get into their seafront hotel, as luck would have it, a couple of rowing boats were spotted on the beach, and Jinky couldn't resist climbing on board one of them and giving a rendition of Sailing. Amidst great hilarity, Rangers' Sandy Jardine decided to push the boat out into the bay, and it was some minutes before anyone realised the danger Johnston was in. Depending on reports, there was only one oar, or no oars at all on the boat, and Johnston was soon several hundred yards offshore on the Firth of Clyde. Davie Hay and Hibs fullback Eric Shadler clambered into another boat to row out to him, but they were forced to return to shore when they realised their craft was badly leaking. The Daily Record reported on the 16th of May 1974. They called in Largs police when they realised wee Jimmy had lost an oar and was drifting. Police contacted local boat hirers John and Tom Halliday, who immediately put out into the bay in their 36-foot launch. John said later, "I asked him what he was doing, and he said I was just going out to fish. He said he was all right, but he had lost an oar. There was no fishing tackle in the boat." John's younger brother Tom said, "I don't follow football, so I didn't recognise him at first." Back on shore, Johnston was treated to a dressing down by Scotland manager Willie Ormond. But when asked about the incident later, Mr. Ormond replied, "Jimmy was in no danger. There will be no disciplinary action. The players have the day off." Johnston came out after lunch to pose for official photographs in a smart blue World Cup suit. All he would say was, "I don't know what all the fuss is about. I was going out to do some fishing." Inevitably, the press went to town on this incident, and Johnston bore the brunt of the criticism, while the role of others in his early morning odyssey was forgotten. He responded by turning in a vintage performance in a 2-0 win over England 3 days later, tormenting their left-back Mike Pidgeck, who never played for his country again. At the end of the match, having swapped shirts with England goalkeeper Peter Shilton, Jinky was hugged on the pitch by Willie Ormond, and then turned and stuck 2 fingers up at the press box. At this point, his place in the team was probably safe. In an interview with Ken Gallagher in the Daily Record of the 24th of May 1974, Argentina manager Vladislav Kapp enthused about Johnston. Immediately I said I was from Scotland, he smiled, gave the thumbs up sign and said, "Jimmy Johnston." Kapp added, "You're a very fortunate country to have a player such as Johnston, the kind of player the whole world wants. The little man is one of the greats. I saw him on television when you beat England, and I've seen him playing for Celtic. Now he looks even better. Johnston has it in him to become one of the great personalities of the tournament. He has so much skill, so much ability. I envy your manager that he has such a player. Throughout his career, Jimmy Johnston was like an unwitting magnet for trouble, and seemed to be always in the wrong place at the wrong time, while others often escaped without censure. Archie Macpherson writes in Jock Stein, the definitive biography, "Only those who would take a warped pleasure out of watching an orphanage burn to the ground could dislike Jimmy Johnston. He exuded a pocky, charming innocence, even though at the height of his career he had gained a reputation as an incorrigible layabout with no sense of responsibility. That was Stein's problem, for he knew that Johnston was a decent lad who would do no harm to anybody but himself. If he had been a real villain, Stein would have had no qualms in booting him out of the club. In fact, he adored this little man, but also believed that he must have been sent by some capricious force to try his patience to the very limits." Jinky was involved in another one of those episodes in June, when Scotland played a friendly in Belgium and flew from there to Norway for their final warm-up match. On the flight, the aircrew served up champagne to the players to celebrate reaching the finals, and it was a well-oiled group who touched down in Oslo, where most went straight to their beds. Jinky and Billy Bremner, though, decided it would be a good idea to take a late-night stroll, and after bumping into a group of Scottish journalists, ended up in a bar. Davie Hay remembers in The Quiet Assassin, "Billy used to go everywhere with this portable record player, and he and Jimmy had been duetting in the bar long after most of us had gone to our beds. Willie Ormond discovered they had gone AWOL, and he ordered them back to their rooms. Words were exchanged in the heat of the moment, and once again we had found that inevitable banana skin." The SFA officials on the trip determined that Johnston and Bremner should both be sent home immediately. But the following day, both players were suitably remorseful and apologetic, and with Willie Ormond pleading their case, it was decided to give them both a final warning. Both played in the 2-1 win over Norway, but Jinky would not kick a ball in anger in West Germany, while Bremner remained as captain and played in all 3 matches. So Jimmy Johnston was denied his one opportunity to play in a World Cup finals, and the only credible explanation for his omission from all 3 matches is his off-field adventures in the weeks before the tournament began. Against that, Jinky was far from the only Scotland player to be involved in misbehaviour before and during the tournament, and if Peter Lorimer's lurid tales of that tournament in his autobiography, Peter Lorimer, Leeds and Scotland Hero, is to be believed, he was a choir boy compared to the antics of many of the others. As Davie Hay put it, "Poor Jimmy, he couldn't get away with anything. He was always getting caught." At the age of only 29, Jinky was set on the path that would lead him out of Celtic less than 12 months later. Davie Hay's World Cup could not have been more different from Johnston's. After an assured showing against Zaire in Scotland's opening match, won 2-0 on the 14th of June 1974, Hay really shone on the biggest stage of all against Brazil 4 days later. Scotland were desperately unlucky not to win, and Hugh Taylor wrote in his match report for the Daily Record of the 19th of June 1974, "The heroes were an inspiring skipper Billy Bremner and the driving Davie Hay." Brazil were a pale and crude imitation of the superstars who had dazzled the world in Mexico 4 years before, and lived down to some of the more negative South American stereotypes against a surprisingly skillful Scottish side. It took Scotland most of the first half to hit their stride, but, Alex Cameron reported in the same edition of the Daily Record, "It was when Davie Hay began driving through from the middle that the whole pattern changed. Twice he nearly scored with shots, but Brazil didn't expect a midfield man to bear down on them in this way. Hay's sheer strength and dedication swept Brazil into almost constant defence." The day after Scotland's 1-1 draw with Yugoslavia, that saw them exit the tournament undefeated at the end of the group stage, Doug Bailey of the Sunday Post predicted that Hay would be the captain of the national side for years to come, writing on the 23rd of June 1974, "The next World Cup is 4 years away in Argentina. Long before then, Billy Bremner's international days will be over. But this early, I can name the man who, barring accidents, will be our captain in 78, Davie Hay. He has been the outstanding Scot in Germany. On the field, he has typified what the Scottish character is all about. Grim determination, ability to rise to the occasion, refusal to be overawed, even the "what or meddle with me" attitude. One Brazilian found that out last Tuesday. He fouled Hay badly. There was no instant retaliation, but the Celt's next tackle on the South American, absolutely legal, must have shaken every bone in the Brazilian's body. He avoided David like the plague thereafter. He is now 25. This World Cup has matured him. He'll develop even further, and by 1978 I believe he could have as great an influence on the Scottish team as George Young had in his heyday, and that was considerable. He has a totally different personality from Bremner. Billy is talkative, never afraid to speak up, and loves to be involved in the wheeling and dealing about perks, etc. Hay is quiet, modest, and prefers to be left on his own. But underneath it all, he has a determined, strong character. He will lead by example. It was Tommy Docherty who nicknamed Hay the Quiet Assassin. The Brazilians were quick to agree after Tuesday, but they also had tremendous admiration for him. One of their reporters asked me, "Where does Hay get his strength from? He gets better and better as a game goes on." Davie Hay's stock was at an all-time high as he returned from West Germany, and it was hoped to sign a new deal with Celtic. Sadly, it didn't work out that way, and the newspaper reports of the time conflict with Hay's recollection that he was ready to sign a new deal. Hay remembers in The Quiet Assassin being called into Celtic Park for talks one Sunday morning and being told by Jock Stein it would be better if he left. The Daily Record reported on Monday the 1st of July 1974, "Scotland World Cup star Davie Hay is up for sale." That was the shock news from the Scottish champion Celtic last night after talks between Hay and manager Jock Stein had taken place at Parkhead. Stein had flown home specially from the World Cup in West Germany for the talks with the player, but the re-signing deadlock, which began last season, remained unbroken. This stands in sharp contrast to Hay's recollection that he had decided to agree to the terms on offer, and already English clubs were circling. Ken Gallagher's report went on, "The for sale announcement came from Stein, who said, 'We don't want to open the season with the same uncertainty and doubt about the player as we had last year. The talks have not changed anything. He wants to move and we won't stop him. We would be interested in a player exchange with cash or a complete cash deal.'" Hay writes in The Quiet Assassin, "Jock looked as though he had had enough of confrontations with me, and also my constant visits to Desmond White's office in town, when I stated I thought I was worth £100 per week. Possibly he believed too that one dissenting voice in the dressing room can lead to others being unhappy with their lot. I sat in the Celtic manager's office years later and realised where Jock was coming from. Also, my teammates might have thought I had got the pay hike I wanted if they saw me staying at the club. That too can lead to all sorts of trouble from within. Jock, plainly, wasn't going to tolerate it any longer. Plus there was the fact that Chelsea were sniffing around and were willing to pay a hefty transfer fee for me." There would be no reason for Hay to lie about those events, writing in his autobiography 35 years later. While it's easy to imagine Celtic not wanting to announce to the fans they'd decided to effectively get rid of the player who had become so indispensable. Things moved quickly from there, and within 3 days, Chelsea had beaten off competition from Queen's Park Rangers and Spurs to sign Hay in a record-breaking deal. Jack Steggles reported in the Daily Mirror of the 4th of July, 1974. "Chelsea's magnificent new £2 million stand, due to open in August, paid its first dividends yesterday when Scottish international Davy Hay signed for the Stamford Bridge club for £225,000. Celtic star Hay, who played brilliantly in midfield in Scotland's World Cup campaign, was so impressed with Chelsea's ambition to build a super stadium that he signed immediately, even though Spurs and Queen's Park Rangers were ready to lure him. Chelsea chairman Brian Mears helped clinch the deal with manager Dave Sexton, who had flown back overnight from the World Cup. Said Mears, "David had a long look around. He saw the new stand and other improvements we are carrying out and was immediately impressed by our ambitions. We have ambitions on the field too, and a player of Hay's immense talents will help us to realise them. We had our setbacks a few weeks ago when Alex Cropley and Peter Simpson refused to join us, but it has all turned out for the best. Hay is a world-class footballer, and players of this calibre do not come on the market very often. Sexton said, "I have signed 3 players in one. Hay is equally at home at fullback, as a sweeper or in midfield. I intend to play him in midfield to give us more skill and steel." Just when they needed it most, Davie Hay's skill and steel were removed from the Celtic midfield. His reluctant departure and its knock-on effect on the emotional state of George Connelly ripped the heart out of the Quality Street gang, and Jock Stein must surely have looked back in later years and regretted the decision to sell Hay, although whether it was his decision or the decision of the board is unclear. While Connelly remained, without Hay's emotional support, his heart was no longer in it, and as his influence waned, his walkouts became ever more frequent. The quest for 10 in a row came to a shuddering halt in the second half of the season, and at the end of the season, the club parted company with Billy McNeil, Jim Brogan and Jimmy Johnston. Only Bobby Lennox remained of the Lisbon Lions, but that was the least of Celtic's problems. That summer, Jock Stein would be involved in a near-fatal car crash, after which things would never be the same again.